Good afternoon, everyone. We're having a little trouble connecting with a couple of different associate groups, and so welcome on this beautiful autumn day. Welcome to those that are in Chicago Heights and our associates that are in Bradley also. And this addition to my body welcomes you also. I knew that God would be leading me this year, but I didn't quite know that He was going to be leading in this way. So I'm so grateful to the many, many people, both associates and our sisters and our staff at St. Agnes, who are being my hands and heart and feet these days, because it's taking many to work with my left hand to make things work. One of the associates at the beginning, and it was Carol, said to me, well, what do you think God's teaching you? Well, I think God has a lot to say during this time. One of our sisters says, Joan, you're always the giver. Now it's time for you to receive. And I certainly am receiving very many gifts, and I'm so grateful to many. We are happy to welcome Sister Susan Karina Dickey today, who's going to be giving our presentation on St. Dominic and St. Catherine, the call to preach in every age. Sister Karina joined the Springfield Dominicans in 1994. Before that, she was a museum curator at the Indiana State Museum in Indianapolis. She specialized in textiles and costumes, and her best-known exhibition was 25 Years of Barbie Dolls in 1985. She's also very knowledgeable about American architecture and furniture. Since 2014, she has been the Vice President of Mission Integration for St. Dominic Health Services, a comprehensive health care ministry sponsored by our Dominican congregation. She promotes St. Dominic's mission and helps to equip her co-workers and board members to provide compassionate care and hope as they preach from the pulpit of everyday life. Sister Karina holds a PhD in American history, which she earned from Texas Tech University, where several years earlier, she received as MA in Museum Science. Her undergraduate degree in history is from Texas Lutheran University. Sister grew up Lutheran and became a Catholic a few years before joining the Dominican Sisters. As a sister, she has ministered in higher education in our diocesan archive and has written a book called Come to the Water about our Springfield history, and beginning in 2007 in healthcare. In May 2010, she received an MA in Healthcare Mission. In 2015, she completed a certificate in bioethics and health policy from Loyola University in Chicago. Sister says, the thread running through my professional life is reflecting on the meaning of work. I've studied architects, builders, cabinet makers, and cowboys, and healthcare workers. Work is always more than the product we produce or the service we supply. It can be a creative expression of self offered for the common good. And so we happily welcome Sister Karina.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. It's such a pleasure to be back and talk with you some about Catherine and Dominic. And to get us started for the prayer, that's the blue sheet of paper. For hundreds of years, the Dominicans have used a prayer called the O Lumen Ecclesiae, or Light of the Church, which is one of the titles of St. Dominic. And at the top of the sheet, I have the words to that hymn. I'm going to sing that, and I ask any of you in the room who know that prayer to sing it with me. And then, since I have the microphone and our audience, our remote audiences depend on sound through the microphone, so I will take all of the parts labeled reader, but everything in dark print would be for you in the assembly. Oh, light of the church, Doctor of truth, Rose of patience, Ivory of chastity, freely have you dispensed the waters of wisdom, preacher of grace, unite us to the blessed. All, O light of the church. Before he was born, Dominic's mother had a dream in which she gave birth to a black and white spotted dog carrying a torch in its mouth. We thank you, God, for the life of Dominic, whose preaching brought the light of Christ to those who lived in ignorance. Sustain the ministry of the Springfield Dominican Sisters and the Dominican Associates by allowing this same light to pass through us in every encounter. Dominic spoke the truth of Christ incarnate, and his preaching upheld the dignity of the human person as a gift of God. We ask you, God, help us to respond to the goodness of all creation and with due reverence to recognize those we serve as your children.
Rose of patience.
Dominic showed remarkable patience with his brethren and with church authorities. Help us, God, to be patient not only with those we serve, but with the many others with whom we collaborate for the sake of ministry.
Ivory of chastity.
Dominic understood that chastity is a way of loving which spins itself for the good of others. Help us, God, to honor our family members, friends, co-workers, and others through words and deeds that speak of you.
Freely have you dispensed the waters of wisdom.
Dominic freely shared his intellectual and spiritual gifts for the common good. Show us, God, how to use our gifts at prayer, at study, at meetings, and in every setting throughout the day.
Preacher of grace, unite us to the blessed.
Dominic's preaching built up unity among the faithful and the entire communion of the saints. Help us, God, be preachers of grace, to build up the bonds of community within the associates and the congregation.
Eternal God, with gratitude for the life of St. Dominic,
Light of the Church, we ask you to bless this session of associate candidate formation. Send the Holy Spirit to instruct us in wisdom, so that, like St. Dominic, we may continue to bring the light of Christ to the world. If you lived in the Diocese of Springfield for several years, you may remember Bishop George Lucas. And he would often begin his addresses to groups of the faithful by asking us to think about, well, what does it mean to live the gospel in your time and place? And I have found that a rich source of meditation over the years, and I've built this presentation around that. Our setting is very different from that of the first disciples in the ancient Near East, nor do we live in the medieval Europe of Dominic and Catherine. But like them, God calls each of us to incarnate or enflesh the gospel in our particular setting, whether that's in the city of Aurora or Marion, Chicago Heights, whether it's in Lima or Harpa, on the prairies of Illinois, or in some other setting. So today, I invite you to look more closely at this crossroad of time and place that produced Dominic and Catherine. And along the way, I'll invite you to look at that intersection in your own life. Although Catherine was born about 175 years after Dominic, they both inhabited the world of medieval Europe. They lived in what we call the Middle Ages, that time between the ancient world of Rome and the modern European nation states that we still know today. Now, I've been a historian for a long time now, and I've reached a conclusion that human nature is constant over time. We have the same basic human needs as Dominic and Catherine and even those who came before, certainly for the physical sustenance and for shelter, but to love and to be loved, to be part of a family, to be part of a community. We share those things, and the range of emotions that we experience, are consistent from age to age. But our attitudes, patterns of thinking, ways of living can be very, very different. So to help set the scene for Dominic and Catherine, let's peel back some layers of time. before a human being walked on the moon. There may even be people here who were not born when someone first walked on the moon. Go back before antibiotics, which were introduced in the 1940s, before Sigmund Freud, before the Reformation. You know, we're coming up on the 500th anniversary, really, in just about, 29 days here, I think. The printing press. In Dominic's lifetime, buttons were an innovation. Buttons were a new thing. Arabic numerals were replacing Roman numerals. Notre Dame Cathedral was being built, and it wouldn't be completed until about 30 years after Dominic died. And St. Peter's Basilica, as we know it, did not exist. Dominic would have been going to what they call the old St. Peter's. So it's a different world. And think no social media, you know, no even typewriters or the printing press. Here's a little medieval humor. Here's the scribe, you know, the copyist, and the librarian there. Darn it, the copier broke down again. It just gives you an idea of how much everything, all the textile production, you know, every piece of cloth, everything is made by hand and very labor intensive. How do we even know anything about people who lived so long ago? Well, today, if you want to know something about somebody, you might go out and buy their biography. Or maybe you order it digitally and you read it on a Kindle or on your iPad. Biography is those writings about a person's life. And we have biographies about Dominic and Catherine, but they rely heavily on what's called hagiography, or the holy writings. And hagiography, the purpose wasn't to record the factual events of someone's life, although there's a lot of facts recorded in these stories, but it's to convey something about the truth of that person for the spiritual edification of the reader or of the listener. And so today I have drawn on both biography and hagiography. This map depicts Europe about halfway between the life of these two saints. You recognize the contours of Europe and maybe roughly some of the countries. The nations as we know them today didn't exist in his time. Dominic was from the Kingdom of Castile in Spain, Catherine from Tuscany, from the city-state of Siena. And society was very highly stratified. With the class you were born into, that's where you stayed for your whole life, and rest on the basis of the peasants who worked the land. That may have been about 80 to 90% of the population, somewhat less so in cities. Cities are emerging during this period of time. And then the knights above that who own land, provide protection to the peoples, and they owe service every year to those who are above them in the social hierarchy. In Dominic's family, they weren't peasants, but they weren't part of that upper layer of the aristocracy either. But Dominic's father was the head man of his village in Calaruega in Castile. Here's Calaruega as it appears today. That large tower in the middle is a structure that survives from his time. And those of us who have had the blessing to be on the Lands of Dominic tour, you think about Dominic probably played around this structure. And there are stairs now, but there would have been ladders, probably climbed up and down, went to the top. You probably threw rocks off the top, you know, who knows. But this was very much part of the scene of his childhood. Calaruega in Dominic's time was near the frontier between Christian Castile and Muslim Spain. And the name means little chalk oven. The landscape reminded me very much of the American Southwest with its table mesas and with you can see the layers of chalk, or in the Southwest you can see the layers of caliche in the land. Herding was a mainstay of the economy. Dominic belonged to that second generation of the Castilians who lived in this region that had formerly belonged to the Moors or to the Muslims of Morocco. This tower, or the Torreon, was part of the defensive frontier. That's why it was there. In fact, if you travel in that part of Spain, you'll see other towers that are very similar, as well as even almost entire castles, or the ruins of castles. Felix de Guzman, his father, then, was not an autonomous or the single ruler. He was the head man, but he depended very much on that cooperation and leading the other men of the village. I think this tells us something about that intersection of time and place, because Dominic grew up in a time and place where ordinary men had some influence on the way things were run. And that probably influenced the way he structured the order and the way that he worked with the other, those first friars. From the beginning, the Dominicans had an elected superior for a term of office, and this was not the usual thing. If you think of the Benedictines, they elected an abbot who would serve for the rest of the abbot's life. But in the Dominicans, there would be that election, and then when that term of office was up and someone else is elected, he goes back to the ranks, and we experienced that in our own community here. The picture at the lower right depicts his mother, Juana, and one of the pious legends, I think this is a matter of the hagiography rather than the biography. One of the legends is that she had this dream about the black and white dog carrying the torch in its mouth, a foreshadowing then of Dominic as light of the church. Another legend that concerns light is that his grandmother says that when he was baptized, a star appeared on his forehead, a sign of God's favor, and consequently later why Dominic is considered a patron saint of astronomers because of the appearance of this star. When he was 7 years old, his parents sent him away to school, which was very typical for a young man of his class. He would be educated under the care of a trusted relative or friend. In his case, it was an uncle who was a priest in the city of Palencia. He received a classical education, that is grammar, logic, mathematics, rhetoric, not the kind of rhetoric we get today, but rhetoric as public speaking, music and astronomy. And of course, he learned Latin, the language of the educated in his day. We don't know his particular vocation story of how Dominic came to be ordained. I can tell you that it's not unusual that within a family, one or two of each generation would be nudged, if not actually set aside, for ordination and or religious life, because those ties of church and state and community are very, very tight. Our notions of separation of church and state that's not part of their mentality. So that you want, it would be important for the honor and for the practical advancement of your family to have members who are well placed in the church. We know that Dominic was ordained in the early 1190s, and early in his priesthood, he went to Osma, which is a cathedral. This is how it appears in recent years. The parts of that wall exist from his time. The tower of the cathedral, though, is quite a bit later, from Dominic's time. At the cathedral at that time, they're staffed by what they call the canons regular, a chapter or a group of priests who educate the next generation of priests, who are administrators in their diocese, who carry on the prayer life of the church. But it is the bishop who has the role of public preaching. And for Dominic, his bishop was Diego. In the picture there, the bottom picture, Diego is the one on the left, Dominic on the right here. About the year 1203 or so, Diego asked Dominic to accompany him on a diplomatic journey. And, why would a bishop be making a diplomatic journey on the behalf of the King of Castile? Well, because that's the way things ran in those days. those ties of blood and community. He sends the bishop as a representative. This was about to take some gifts and for negotiations about a marriage and the royal family. I've had the picture at the top there to give you some idea of the entourage that would be involved. It's still kind of a mystery just exactly where they were going from northern Spain. Some think it was to the kind of the far edges of northern Europe in present-day Denmark. Some think no, it was maybe more to the east. We don't know. We know it was a long journey. And so they would have pack animals because they're taking gifts with them. They would need interpreters. They would need, camp as well as stay at inns, so they'd need to bring food and supplies, and it would be quite an undertaking for a journey of this length. And let me say, let's stop here. Let's stop here to pause and reflect for a moment. I want to say a little bit more about Diego and Dominic. Diego becomes a significant influence in the life of Dominic. I think we can safely infer, even though we don't have a lot of letters and documents from those two men, that Diego saw potential in Dominic as a leader, as well as in Dominic's piety and his spirituality. And so he cultivates Dominic. And that's one of the reasons he would ask him to go on this journey. So let's pause now for a short period for you to reflect at your tables about the places and the historical times that have shaped you. I think we have at least 3, if not 4 generations represented in the room. So that's something to take into consideration. And then, was there a mentor or some other person who's been a great influence in your life, especially in terms of nurturing your spirituality? So let's take about 5 minutes for you to have some conversation at your table. I hesitate to cut you short, but we got a late start, so we'll go on. Might there be 1 or 2 people who would like to say a little something about that influence of the time or place, or the importance of a mentor? I'll bring the mic to you.
My grandmother Stanley was a big influence in my life. She was, now that I think about it and know about preaching from your life, the pulpit of your life, grandmother did that. She went to Mass every day. Her husband was killed when she was pregnant with her 4th child. But she was the most joy-filled Christian I know. She was the glue that held the family together. And she taught at the School for the Deaf. And she loved that work. When she died, Monsignor spoke of the ballet of her interpreting the scriptures at Mass every Sunday, and she called baptism the ticket to heaven. She stayed in touch with many, many, many former students for years and years. So she was just a person who was a magnet to others. Her faith was very strong, and we were all very thankful to have her in our lives.
Thanks, Gina. Time for one more? Okay, maybe later. I can remember it was Sister Linda Tonelato who taught me Dominican history when I first entered, and I think she said one time something like, if there hadn't been a Diego, there might not have been a Dominic. Now, on this journey, Dominic has a life-changing experience. They have crossed the Pyrenees and they've come into the part of southern France, and they're staying at an inn in the city of Toulouse. It's now sometime there in 1203 or 1204. One of the things is I've done all this, reading and study about saints and such. Usually saints are depicted in splendid isolation. It's a kind of a portrait. This is a more contemporary picture of Dominic at the inn with the innkeeper. And it's his first encounter with someone who belonged to a religious sect called the Cathars, or they're also known as the Albigensians because they were such a concentration of them near the city of Albi. And these Cathars, I don't really do justice to their doctrine here, but they were dualists. They saw the world divided as good and evil. And there was a God of good and a God of evil, and things that were material, including the human body, they believed those were intrinsically evil, and spiritual things were good things. They lived very simply, but they were, the Catholic Church considered them to be heretics because they rejected Jesus as the Savior. They looked to Jesus as an exemplary figure, who set a good example, but not as the Savior. So this was Dominic's first encounter with someone who held these beliefs. And the story is that they talked through the night, and by the morning, the innkeeper was ready to be reconciled with the church. I think this story shows us a couple of things about Dominic. His concern for the eternal soul of the individual with whom he encountered, and his willingness to engage in conversation, particularly that willingness to engage with the ideas of a different way of thinking. If we could only have more of that in today's world. I think it might be helpful to get this setting of Dominic's life to look at a definition of heresy that is more contemporary to Dominic rather than how we might define it today. Now, Aquinas comes later, but heresy is that species of infidelity in persons who, having professed the faith of Christ, corrupt its dogmas. And that would be Dominic's understanding. In this case, hard to say. We don't know, had he been a Christian and then he became a Cathar, or had he grown up with it? We don't know. The important thing is that they came from two different religious worlds, and through that conversation and dialogue, the Cathar came into the reconciliation with the church. To the medieval mind, heretics and the faithful could not coexist. Religious ideas of religious toleration and pluralism are foreign to their way of thinking. And this area where Dominic and Diego were traveling, there were many, many Cathar strongholds. So this was not the only Cathar he would have encountered on this journey. And I think, we wouldn't talk about it this way, I think, in the 21st century, but Dominic's concern for the eternal salvation of those souls, that was an idea he went back to over and over, and what will become of sinners? And I'm sure he was thinking of those verses about, well, how can people know if no one goes to preach to them? And so Dominic and Diego, they continue with their journey to the marches, and they come back and they have a little side trip to Rome, and they're kind of going around it. But they both are intrigued and attracted and drawn, and I would say called, to preach to the Cathars. And with the appropriate permissions and so forth, they find a way to do this. So they returned eventually to Ozma, and then they set out a second time as part of phase 2 of that diplomatic journey. This time on the way home, they linger in that area of southern France. And they joined with some Cistercians to preach to the Cathars, but they meet with very limited success. And again, time-wise, we'll skip over a lot of the story. There are some excellent books. That's why I've given you a bibliography if you want to read more about this, or go to some of the websites that will tell you more about the story. Late in 1206, Diego and Dominic begin to spend more time near the little village of Fangeau, and nearby Pruy or Pruya. And there's a little rundown church there that becomes their headquarters. They go out to different cities for disputations. They engage those Cathar teachers, they're having debates, very, formal, stylized kinds of debates. I haven't seen any images about debates that show Cathar women attending, but there must have been some who were hearing Dominic and Diego and the others, because they reconciled with the church, a small group of them, and then it's in 1206 that they set up the first monastery of what becomes eventually then the order of preachers, the first nuns, the first Dominican nuns. Diego and Dominic were concerned, well, what would happen to these women because they have left the Cathars? Of course, their families have disowned them and won't have anything to do with them. One night when Dominic is looking out over the spot that you see here, he sees a ball of fire descend from the heavens on this little rundown church at Pruy. And this is the spot. This is where we'll set up these women, and they call it the Signadu, the sign of God. And it's one of the more moving things if you ever get to go to Fangeau, to be at that site where Dominic looks out over the valley and sees the fire. And so they gather that small group of women, and you have the beginnings of the nuns. Their prayer and their penance becomes a support for the preaching mission. And we look to that Pruy as the model for the relationship between the friars and the nuns, that relationship of mutual support. And then here's the view looking the other way. This is Fangeau as it appears today. And here more of an artistic depiction. Dominic and Diego keep going out on these preaching missions. They notice that the Cathars live very simply, and their preachers don't go around on horses, and they don't have interpreters and all the entourage. And so it's Dominic and Diego who have the thought that, we really need to give up the horses and the rest of it, because that will give us credibility in the eyes of the Cathars if we live a lifestyle more like them. And so they did that. Here are a couple of depictions of these debates or disputations. The one on the right, that's a rather famous story. So they've had their debate. Here you see Dominic and you see the Cathars around them, you see a fire. Part of the medieval mentality is you subject something to an ordeal. So this was ordeal by fire. And so the Cathars tossed their holy book into the fire, and it burned up. And Dominic tosses their holy book, probably a Bible, into the fire, but it leaps out of the flames. And that's a sign of God's favor and that they're telling the truth. And although it didn't mean that the Cathars automatically gave up their ways. But this is one of those stories that's handed down among the Dominicans to show that God's favor was with Dominic and Diego at this time of their life, and their search for truth and their preaching of truth. The other picture I think is kind of interesting because here you have Dominic, and you can see the range of reaction. Here's a man just turning away. Here's another one. It looks like you're crazy. Here's some, looks like they're probably trying to say, no, you're wrong. Let me tell you, what it's really like. And then here's one who seems to be kind of giving some serious consideration to what he's hearing. And then notice the dogs down here. There's a little play on the words here in the Latin. The Dominicanis, the Dominicans are the dogs of God, and the spotted dogs represent the Dominicans. And here's a little sheep that they've managed to, wrest from the Cathars, and they're guarding the sheep. But here's the Cathar dog. See the dark dog? And he's stealing a sheep away. And there goes the dog of God out to get him. So there's a little medieval Dominican humor for you there. That image, that larger image, by the way, is at Santa Maria Novella in Florence. Some Cistercians had joined with them. I mentioned how they don't meet with a lot of success. The Cistercians fall away, discouraged, and in 1207, Diego left to return to Osma. He'd been away from his cathedral for some time by then. And then, as it happens, just within 4 or 5 months, Diego dies. And Dominic is feeling very isolated and alone. The new bishop allowed Dominic to remain in southern France. But this is some of the darkest days for Dominic, and what will become of these Cathars? What about the women that he's gathered at Prouy, this small preaching mission? Times are very dim for him. One of their Cistercian companions was assassinated, and this brings about, the Pope then calls a crusade against the Cathars. And it was brutal, and it continued for many years. In fact, this particular crusade didn't conclude until several years after Dominic died. So it gives you some idea of the instability, the religious and the political instability in this region where he was living and ministering. There was, in fact, an attempt on Dominic's life. On the path between Fanjeaux and Prouille, and this is a cross that's been erected to mark that spot. We don't know directly what Dominic thought of the crusade. I can think it must have been a source of great sadness to him, the loss of life, the disruption of people's lives. And yet that's the seedbed, if you will, from which the order is nourished and begins to come into a more organized existence. The Bishop of Toulouse welcomed the Dominicans to his city in 1215, and this would become their permanent home for many, many years. And here's a little remnant of a building that a family gave to Dominic and his followers. The sister you see here there we go. This is Sister Suzanne Nafke, one of the great Dominican scholars. And what we think that house looked like at the time that Dominic and the others lived there. So they have a stability, and now they have a patron in the Bishop of Toulouse. And that's very important for helping them to get onto an established order. The bishop's mandate for the Dominic and the preachers was to root out heresy, to drive out vice, to teach the creed, and to inculcate in men sound morals. That's words that comes from one of our Dominican histories. They're to preach to the heretics and instruct the faithful. So no longer just to the Cathars, but to this improved preaching and catechesis of those who are already in the church. The bishop entrusts this mission to them within his diocese in perpetuity. And they're to beg for their subsistence, although he gives them various gifts and so that make it possible for their material life to carry on. One of the things that emerges about what becomes the order of preachers at this time is that they are engaged in mental work, preaching, the preparation for preaching, the study, not in manual labor, which would be the typical of the Benedictines and the Cistercians, who have, these, really their monasteries are kind of like little industries, where they're milling and they're making textiles and they're making different things for their support. But the Dominicans replace manual labor with that mental and theological labor. In the fall of 2015, Dominic accompanied the bishop to Rome for the Lateran Council, and they're ready to ask for a formal recognition of this group that has the recognition of the bishop, but now to be recognized by the wider church. And to make a long story short, that recognition comes in 3 different phases. One of them has to do with, if you're going to have, the church had decided we have too many religious orders. No more religious orders. You have to have a rule that already exists, and so they adopt the rule of St. Augustine, which is the rule that we use to this day throughout the order. It has great flexibility and provides a kind of structure and a spirituality for our common life together. So that gets settled pretty early on. And then there's a series of other decrees by the Pope that they will have this mission of preaching. And the innovation here is that they will be itinerant preachers. And so the preaching isn't reserved just to the bishop anymore. This is one of the big breakthroughs. But that these men are authorized to preach with the permission of the bishop. And now, by the time the order then is organized in 1216, not just in that one diocese where they began, but they are free to go anywhere. And within a few years, they do. They spread all over Europe. And so notice these dates, 1216 and then 1217 is the last one. So you know, last year we had our 800th anniversary as Dominicans. The friars are formed through their prayer together, the liturgy of the hours, through the sacraments, through their study that they do on their own and the study they do together, and they're living in community. Now, you know, this sounds like the life that I live and many others in this room. Those characteristics, those elements of Dominican life were there from the beginning, and they endure to this day. And while the order has had its ups and downs over the centuries, if you look at the number of Dominicans or the repression of the order in revolutionary France and so forth, there is that enduring value of the charism, the gift of God, to the order of preachers. And you see that in the prayer, in the study, in community, in the mission. From the onset, the Dominican men were a clerical institute. That is, they to be preachers, to preach publicly, they had to be ordained. There were also what we call today cooperator brothers, who would do some of the manual labor. Today there are cooperator brothers in the order. Many of them are teachers, professors, and they minister in other capacities. So they remain a vibrant part of the order as well, although most Dominican men are ordained priests. The history of the order, I think, in some ways is marked by paradox. We provided the Catholic Church with a good number of the court personnel that participated in the Inquisition, and yet, at the same time, the internal structures of the order provided a commitment to certain democratic freedoms, and I mentioned earlier, the election of a prior, the self-governing structures that were put in place early on and which have endured within the order. Maybe another time we could have a whole thing about Dominicans and the Inquisition. In some ways, I think we've gotten a lot of bad press, and we've gotten the blame for some things that we were not part of, or only on the peripheries. By 1221, there were 12 priories in Europe. By 1300, about 10,000 friars. And I think one of the measures of Dominic's success was this continuation of the founding, or of the foundation after his death. It's not simply a cult of personality. You may recall, I think most of you in this room can remember when Mother Teresa of Calcutta died, and some were saying, well, will her institute endure? Because if something relies too heavily on the cult of personality rather than the providence of God, it cannot endure. Dominic, I think partly because of his foresight as a leader and his disposition and the way the order was set up in its early years, assured that continuity. And so there is an organized succession of leadership from the time of Dominic's death. He didn't even want to be re-elected, the major superior, and he consented to it. But there were others in the wings ready to come on board at the time of his death. Dominic died in 1221. He died and is buried in the city of Bologna. Some years later, it was necessary to move the remains for an expansion of the church. And it's that time they opened up the tomb, The witnesses talk about, this is here part of that medieval spirituality. They talk about the sweet odor that comes from the tomb, a sign of God's favor on Dominic. They move him to another location then within the church. The picture you see at the right is the tomb as it appears today, which is a composite of several different artists, including Michelangelo. They continue to embellish it over the years. One of the things I think that's kind of interesting about the Dominicans compared to other contemporaries is, there's a political aspect here. And when I took medieval history, one of the things I learned is that, you have a founder of a religious community. And so those brothers, or for the women, those sisters, they promote the cult of their founder. And they want to get him canonized, because then they can get more donations and they can be stronger and they can draw more members and so forth. The Dominicans, I think this is so fascinating, they didn't really do much to promote Dominic's cult in those early years after his death. It wasn't until this movement, the translation of the body from the original tomb to another, that they began to think about, we ought to think about getting Dominic canonized. And they did. I think that's 1234 is when the church recognized Dominic as a saint. So we've flown through the life of Dominic here. Do you have any questions or anything you'd like to remark about before we take a short break? Okay. Then we'll have a short interview. How much time do we have, Sister Joan?
Probably 15.
About 15 minutes.
We'd just like to thank the Springfield Associates again. Today, Dee and Jan and Ann are helping us and are welcoming us. Also to Joelle Murr, one of our candidates today, who brought the baklava. Is that how you say it, Joelle? It's a special treat for us, so enjoy.
Let's move on with the life of St. Catherine. So think back now to that hymn we began with, Dominic, Light of the Church, Doctor of Truth, Rose of Patience, Ivory of Chastity. He ushered his companions through very turbulent times, but he secured the future for the order of preachers and for the preaching mission. He developed an order of friars who were mobile, learned, who patterned themselves on the Gospel of Luke 10, where Jesus sends out the 72. He developed the structure for dealing with the challenges of his time, structures that have proven to be timeless. And Catherine, like Dominic, was born in the Middle Ages, but in a very different setting. She was born in the city-state of Siena, so I should say she's an urbanite, and he was small town. But the most significant difference is that Catherine was a woman, Dominic was a man, and I think it can be hard for us to appreciate the importance that their contemporaries gave to the distinctions between men and women. And some of us in the room are old enough to remember when that was more typical, of our lifetimes even. The mixing of sexes we have in the workplace and in social settings that we just kind of take as normal now, I really can't think of anything in history that has precedence for that. That level of mixing we have today is something new that has emerged in our own times. So Dominic and Catherine lived in the world where mixing was more within the family circle, not out in the public sphere. And one of the reasons Catherine is such a famous figure or in some circles an infamous figure, is because of the way she interacted with men and women. And then here's a map of Italy. Modern Italy, as we know it, didn't really come into existence until the 19th century. So she's part of a vibrant regional culture, speaks a Sienese dialect. Suzanne Naki and Karen Scott are among the scholars who are actually have fluency in that dialect and have translated her letters and other writings. So we have more direct information from Catherine than we do from Dominic, because her letters and her writings have been preserved over time. Here's Siena as it appears today. And this piazza or plaza was there in her time that you see here in the foreground. Then here's what the Duomo, or the cathedral, which was under construction in her time. But the church where Catherine spent most of her time in Siena is this one, the Basilica of San Domenico. It's enormous. It's not as big as the Duomo, but it's a very impressive building. And this was her parish church. And it was staffed by Dominicans, so she knew Dominicans from her earliest days. And then her father's place of business, this is the way it appears today. We don't really know what it looked like in her own time. But her father was a wool dyer. So he's a businessman. He's an important merchant. And then, let's see here. So this is kind of her neighborhood over here, and there's a rather steep hill right here. I can't imagine what Catherine's family must have been like. I don't have brothers or sisters. I grew up in a home that was very quiet. She was one of 26 children. Several sets of twins, and several who died in infancy and young in life, but still a big family, many of them under the one roof at one time. She was the youngest. She was a twin, and the twin didn't survive. So she's the baby of the family, and I just can't imagine this building that is the combination of the home. We know the vats for the dyeing of the wools and stuff were on the lowest level. The family lives on the upper levels, but it had to be a busy and noisy place most of the time. And some of you from your family backgrounds, could probably have a better sense of what that might have been like. Keep in mind that Siena was often a violent place, full of feuding factions. And she lived through outbreaks of the bubonic plague. So some scary times. Here's another picture of the medieval dye vat. Whoops, pressed the wrong button. Here's the church again, another view. The shrine of Catherine of Siena today. Benincasa is the family name, so it's called Benincasa. And then this little building down here is a fountain, a public fountain, where people would go to fetch water for their use. And then here's Benincasa as it appears today. And the statue you see here has been copied many times. In fact, in St. Catherine's Village, which is a retirement community that is part of St. Dominic's, we have a replica of this statue in the garden there. We know that from the life of Catherine that she was a pious child very, very early in life. She has an unusual degree, an unusual intense spiritual connection with the divine. According to legend, she had her first mystical experience when she was just 6 or 7 years old. While walking home one day with some of her brothers and sisters, she fell into a trance as she entered the city gates. And it's at this time that she decides she's going to give her heart to Jesus. And even so, her childhood was normal by many of the standards of the day. She had chores. One of her chores was to be sent to this fountain to fetch water and carry it uphill. She must have been pretty strong. Years later, in her writing, she uses the image of a cup that is constantly being filled and flowing out at the same time. That's an image of the divine love of Jesus. It always is filling us up and overflowing. At the age of 77, she makes a private vow of virginity. This is, between her and God. She's decided that she is going to devote her life exclusively to God. Now, a girl of her social standing, though, would be expected to marry when she reaches her mid-teens. And marriage isn't the companionate marriage that we think of, where couples marry for mutual love. In her day, in her society, marriage is a social arrangement. Love is not unknown in these arrangements, but made for the mutual benefit of the two families. And those connections, just like I talked about Dominic and those ties of blood and having somebody in the church and so forth. Well, in her culture, those ties that are made through marriage are extremely important. And she would be expected to do her duty by marrying the man that her parents would choose for her. Well, she gets to be a teenager and she's not going to have any of this marriage talk, and she cuts her hair. Now keep in mind the context here. I'm looking around the room. Most of the women in the room, we've got pretty short hair, shoulder length or shorter. But in her day, no, you got long hair, and women cut their hair if they enter the monastery and they're going to become nuns. That was part of that renunciation of the world and the physical beauty of woman's crowning glory, her hair. So to cut her hair, I want to be sure here to get across that that's a very radical sign of her determination to live for God alone. She also wants to try, she doesn't follow the set pattern here for a girl of Siena. She wants to join the Third Order Dominicans. Those are lay Dominicans. And the women in those days, the lay Dominicans, were widows. And they pray and they do good works. Here she is. She's like 17, 18. And she wants to be one of these women. They call them the mantellate because the mantle that they wore. And she pleads and pleads and pleads with her parents, and the women of the mantellate, they're not so keen about letting her in either, because here's this crazy girl, and how could she possibly be prepared to engage in the kind of good works that we do, and she's just an unknown. She's like dynamite. So, but eventually, both the ladies of the mantellate and her father relented, and they allowed her to join the mantellate. And then what happens? Again, going against all expectations. Then she goes into, decides it's time for seclusion, or she feels God is calling her to a time of seclusion instead of being the prayers and the good works of the mantellate. She attends church at San Domenico, and this is the picture. This is the view, more or less, that she would have had from where the mantellate sat at the back of the church. And this famous picture that you see of Catherine here is a fresco in that church. So she does spend time at church. She just doesn't engage in the usual activities of the other ladies. Her family, to punish her, makes her engage in menial chores and wait at table and clean things and so forth. But in her mind, she turns this into, she imagines she is serving God and Jesus and the saints. And it's an important time of her mystical development. Catherine experiences mystical espousal in 1366. That brings to an end that period of isolation, and then after this she does have a more life outside of her home. In the Catholic tradition, mystical espousal is granted to some when Christ takes on the mystic as a bride. In her vision, the Christ child came to her to give her a ring, which at her request was invisible to others. From our 21st century perspective, mystical espousal may seem rather over the top or just crazy, but it's very much part of the spirituality of her day. After this time, she lives on little more than water, sometimes mixed with a little bit of wine, and she eats raw vegetables. Her family were very concerned and saw this as part of her stubbornness. And one of the books I put on your list about holy anorexia is, today she'd probably be diagnosed as anorexic. But for her, it's a spiritual discipline to consume very little food, very little water, and she relies on the Eucharist for her physical and spiritual sustenance. The Blessed Sacrament was the food that sustained her. In her day, the laity did not receive communion every Sunday, let alone every day. But among the stories told about her is that the consecrated host would fly from the hand of the priest across San Domenico, where Jesus would then present it to Catherine himself. This is also the time of her life when she has a series of visions of hell, purgatory, and heaven. She undergoes great spiritual tortures. And I guess let me give you some context. This gives you some glimpse of the medieval mentality about spirituality. And she practiced what by our standards would be extreme penances, whipping and scourging herself. I've already mentioned the semi-starvation. And yet, in the context of her time, these are practices that are much admired. She begins to travel around and preaching publicly, and with such great effect that the order sends friars with her so they can hear the confessions of those who want to do penance and become closer to God. In 1375, she receives the stigmata, the signs of the wounds of Christ, again at her request, not visible to anyone else, but in the major legend by Raymond of Capua, another Dominican blessed, remained a source of pain to her for the rest of her life. This medieval mentality about these mystical experiences and visions, whatever you think, did they really happen? Is that part of that pious hagiography that's been handed down over the ages? I think the important takeaway for us is that these have been handed down as signs to us of her great intimacy with Christ, especially with the suffering Christ. That's what it all boils down to, is that God gave her that gift to identify with the sufferings of Jesus and the suffering of those around her. And so she did take direct care of the sick. In fact, she's a patron saint of nurses, which is stories I've used at St. Dominic's from time to time. Here are a few other scenes from her life. At the bottom left is she receives the Eucharist from Jesus. At the upper right, the exchange of hearts. In one of the Old Testament canticles, because I will take from you your stony hearts and give you a living heart. So the exchange of hearts is one of her experiences. Tortured by demons at the upper left. And then the other panel there are two parts to this panel. On this side, Catherine encounters a beggar, and she gives him a coat. You can see he has nothing. And then a few hours later, Jesus appears to her with that same coat. So this speaks to us, of course, that when we encounter the poor, we encounter Christ. She ministered to poor people in several ways. I've already mentioned visiting the sick. She wrote letters to prisoners. She accompanied a man to his execution. Just many, many ways that she was the actual physical presence, became the presence, the hands and the voice of Christ to those around her. During her day, the papacy was in exile in France. The situation in Rome was not conducive to the presence of the Holy Father. And she writes to him, goes to see him. Gregory the 11th at Avignon in France, and says, but your place is in Rome. Come home. You need to go. And it's very bold. This is another one of those things that gives her that, reputation as a contrarian. Because who would presume to speak to the Pope that way, and especially for a woman, and not just to ask him, beg and tell him. His place is in Rome. She wrote to other public leaders. I think we might interpret this as social justice advocacy, is the way we might look at these things. She lived in this very turbulent era when the city-states were often at war with one another, and sometimes Siena or other cities sent her as a representative. One of the words that keeps coming back to me from my medieval studies is virtus, which is, I guess you would call manly virtue. And she was said to possess virtus, which she would have understood as a great compliment, to have manly virtue, to take these public roles. So she has a role as a diplomat and then as a public preacher that I've already alluded to here. The writer, nearly 400 letters have been preserved, and then in 1377 she begins a conversation with God called the Dialogue. And the stories preserved by Raymond in his Legend of Catherine is that she herself was said to be barely literate, and certainly was not fluent in Latin. She would dictate, and scribes would write down what becomes the content of the dialogue, which you can obtain in our library here, or it's still in print. It's pretty easy to obtain. Prayers have been preserved as well and are readily available in book form. I've already mentioned about her spiritual advisor, the Dominican Raymond of Capua, who wrote her hagiography. That was how I was introduced to Catherine. Medieval history was one of my minors when I worked on my doctorate. And I really think it was divine providence that book was assigned to me instead of some other. And while it's sort of fantastic, and a lot of these stories I've told you come from that particular book, it was that intimacy with Jesus that spoke to me, and I think to modern readers, even though we have a very different sensibility about spirituality. Raymond of Capua, by the way, his feast day is coming up this Thursday. Here's a depiction of the death of Catherine, and this is a pretty typical medieval way to depict the death of a saint. Is you have the saint is in the bed, surrounded by her friends and her little group of disciples, and then the soul ascending into heaven. She dies in 1380. The last 3 years of her life were very hard. The scholar Suzanne Nafi says she had ruined her health through their penances and through her diet in particular. Suzanne says that even Catherine probably realized that she had harmed herself and with her extreme penances. So she's sick much of that time in the final few years of her life. The church is still a mess in terms of the Pope, and even though he's come back to Rome, there's still other men who are claiming I'm the real Pope, and it's a very sad time for her to see the church in such distress. And one of the visions that she has is the bark of Peter, the ship of Peter. And maybe you've seen an icon of her. She's holding this rather heavy ship on her shoulder, and it weighs her down. And that feeling, of course, is not confined to Catherine or even to her own age. There are other times in history when we feel the weight of the burdens that we experience as the church and in our world. She died on April 30th, which that year was the Sunday before the Ascension. She's canonized some years later, so her followers, did not forget her. The stories are gathered and handed on. The writings are preserved. So later generations know a great deal about her. And then I've mentioned so many ways in which she's an unusual figure by the standards of her day. Well, even hundreds of years after her death, she blazes a trail again. And in 1970, It's Pope Paul VI declares her, along with Teresa of Avila, to be doctors of the Church. And a doctor of the Church is when the Church has examined someone's life and their writings. They're said to be upheld then as being edifying to the faithful, that they do not contain any doctrinal error, and that they are worthy of our study and our veneration. So she becomes the first of the two, one of the first two doctors, women to be doctors of the Church. Since then, a number of others have been named. I think we might be up to about 8 or 9 by now. But a distinct honor to Catherine and to the Order of Preachers. Now here's another little thing about the medieval mentality. The veneration of the saints and the relics of the saints. And so a famous a person known for their holiness dies. Everybody wants peace. Partly out of their true, genuine, that's their spirituality. And there's always that monetary aspect too. If you've got a place of pilgrimage, well, you know that brings people in. So Rome and Siena have a little fight over her remains. Her head, her mummified head, ends up in Siena, where you can see it today at San Domenico, and then the rest of the body is entombed at San Sisto in Rome. I'm sorry, she's at Santa Maria sopra Minerva. Gave you the wrong church there. You've got this really quick overview here, and I really encourage you to do a little more reading on your own, or at least go to 1 or 2 of those websites. The sites on Wikipedia are actually pretty good about Dominic and Catherine. I have checked them out again recently, and I would recommend them. But to finish up our reflection today in the next 10 minutes or so, a couple more points for reflection at your tables. You've learned a little bit about these saints and their attributes, their practices, and a little bit about their spirituality. What is it about them that you admire? Or even what traits of them do you see in you? They took on that. I love this modern motto of the order, preaching from the pulpit of everyday life. They were doing that. How are you preaching from the pulpit of everyday life? You won't be doing it in the same way as Dominic or Catherine. You'll be doing it in your own way. You already are. So I invite us to take, let's take about another 6 or 7 minutes to ponder that, and then I'll have some concluding remarks. I think, oh, it's back. Thank you very much for your attention today, and those conversations you've started, of course, are ones that could be continued at any time and in a different context. To conclude, I have this image of the Dominican saints and blesseds gathered around the crucified Christ. Dominic and Catherine are just 2 of the Dominican saints and blesseds. Last year I compiled a list. There's well over 100. I think it's close to 150 who have been recognized by the church through the centuries. The ones up on the window in the chapel or in the mosaic. You've seen some of the major ones. But this picture isn't complete until we gather around this picture. And one of the things I love about our chapel and that mosaic is how we come together around the altar. The past and the present come together at the altar of the Eucharist. So Dominic and Catherine lived a long time ago. We don't have that experience of having known them firsthand, but we know them through each other. We know them through those writings that have been preserved. We know them through our other encounters with the Dominican family. We know them through our contemplation of the artwork that has been handed on across the centuries. There are many, many ways that we experience our belonging to the Dominican family. Dominic and Catherine have inspired generations of members of the order. And we have in them not just examples, but we have a brother and a sister who understand what it is to live in this human condition with this flesh that Dominic upheld as a good gift of God. They inspire and accompany us in our trials and our joys. So I hope that you've enjoyed learning a little more about them, and even those of us who have been familiar with them for many years, it's a chance to renew our acquaintance with these two giants of our order. So I thank you very much, and I wish you the best on your journey as Dominican Associates. We're so happy to have you with us. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sister Susan Karina, for your love and knowledge of history. It certainly enriches this presentation. And I think the biography, the hagiography, and the bibliography will help us to keep studying the lives of Dominic and St. Catherine. Just a couple of announcements. If you did not attend the Day of Reflection, or you were not here for the first session of Sister Margaret Teresa's Day of Prayer, Aaron has provided us with the link for the YouTube connection, which can be used. And I have one DVD presently that he just gave us. We are putting them on DVDs also that someone can take if you would like to take it now. Otherwise, if you would please email me. I'll try to email the ones I know have missed, but email me and ask for that. We'll send you that link. Our next presentation is the first Sunday in November, November the 5th, and it will be given by Sister Marceline Cook on Catholic social teachings. And we've talked with her about weaving into that some of the work of our Dominican anti-racism team. And so we look forward to being with Sister Marceline the next time. So enjoy this month of October. The papers say we have to create some of our own color because they're not lasting very long. But let's go and preach the gospel with our everyday life. God bless you all.
Thank you.